This is the Commodore SX-64, and while it really needs no introduction, I just did it anyway. I'm Matt D'Amico, and welcome to episode 23 of Retro Bits. The Commodore SX-64 was released in 1984 at a retail price of just under $1,000 or around $2,500 in today's currency. Also known as the Executive 64, it has the distinction of being the world's first color portable computer, featuring a built-in 5-inch CRT screen. While the number of SX-64 units sold isn't known, the machine was not a market success, due in equal parts to its size, weight, poor marketing, and lack of business applications when compared against other portables of the era.
In a world of fun and fantasy and ever-changing views.
Now, if you're a Commodore buff, there's a good chance you've seen this ad before.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you. Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
If you've seen episode 6 on the TI-99 and the home computer price war of the 1980s, you'll remember that Commodore boss Jack Tramiel was engaged in a bloody battle with his competitors that would reshape the entire industry at the time. In light of the events of the day, reading between the lines of this lighthearted jingle, you almost get the feeling that it's a thinly veiled challenge to Jack's rivals. Are you keeping up with the Commodore? Because the Commodore's keeping up with you.
'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you. Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
So let's take a quick look at this Commodore 64 luggable. Weighing in at 23 pounds, or 10.5 kilograms, it features a detachable keyboard, color screen, and built-in 1541 disk drive. Behind this flap are the volume control and screen adjustment knobs. At the top of the machine, a cartridge slot hides behind this trap door. And around back, we have the standard complement of joystick ports, AV output, serial IEC connection for disk drives and printers, a user port, and power supply. The SX-64 is portable, but it can only operate on mains power. Due to the built-in monitor and disk drive, both the tape interface and RF modulator that are standard on regular 64s are not present here. As a result, the SX has a slightly different kernel ROM that omits the cassette tape controls and updates shift run stop to load the first program from disk instead, similar to Jiffy DOS. The SX measures nearly 15 by 15 inches square and 5 inches tall, so you probably won't be taking it on your next flight, whenever that is. While there's no disputing its girth, when compared to a 128D that also has a built-in power supply and disk drive, it's not all that much larger, given that it also houses a CRT. If you've seen the most recent unboxing episode, you'll remember that this machine was loaned to the channel by my neighbor. It's in surprisingly good condition for its age, and all the parts are present and accounted for, but it does have some issues that we'll take a look at today. The SX features a carrying handle with a ratcheting mechanism that allows it to lock in place and double as a stand. One side isn't locking properly, and it's pretty obvious what's wrong here. The other side seems to be working fine, but the plastic cap has fallen off, a common issue with these machines. Fortunately, it wasn't lost like so many of them are, so we'll fix it later. The bolt on this side had backed out almost all the way. Just twisting the handle was enough to clear the last of the threads, and it came out entirely. No wonder it wasn't working right. And here's the other problem. The system was working the last time the owner used it, but in the interim, it appears something's failed. This particular error is often caused by a bad RAM chip. It's not uncommon for vintage hardware to fail while just sitting in a closet. As explained by Bill Hurd, designer of the Commodore 128, these systems were made to last 3 to 5 years. At his talk given at last year's Vintage Computer Federation, Bill goes on to detail the many reasons chips and systems fail. First, and most obvious, is that there's always a compromise between cost, materials, and time for design and testing. Next are environmental factors. Heat is probably the most well-known cause of chip failure, but there are many others. Over time, moisture from the environment can actually pass through the epoxy used in the chip package. Vibration can also damage them, so don't store your collection next to a refrigerator. Ultraviolet degrades materials over time, and electrostatic discharge from your skin can harm the machine by way of the joystick or cartridge port, even if you've never opened up the case. And failures caused by ESD don't always show up immediately, but can manifest years later. Dust collects mold and moisture, which cause oxidation. Not only were these machines built to a price point, limiting the use of exotic materials, but material technology itself wasn't as advanced 30 years ago, and parts simply had a shorter shelf life than they do today. That brings us to the last point. Chips wear out. When powered on, the electromagnetic field from applied voltage causes physical damage to oxide layers. The movement of electrons also causes damage, and dielectric materials degrade over time. And even worse than heat alone is repeated thermal cycling. As a result, whether you use them or not, eventually all of these machines will stop working. In order to validate my theory that there's a bad RAM chip, I'm going to try using the Commodore dead test cartridge. Before that, I need to fish out this Jiffy DOS kernel select switch that's been tucked away in here. The dead test cartridge is an invaluable tool for diagnosing critical failures in a 64, as it bypasses a number of built-in chips and is able to boot machines that have failures that would otherwise prevent them from starting. If the dead test detects a bad RAM chip, it will flash the screen a certain number of times to indicate where the fault may lie. Often there's more than one bad RAM chip, so the process must be repeated after fixing the first error. With the SX-64 screen, it's difficult to tell if this is one flash or two, so I'll connect up an external monitor to verify. Okay, that's definitely one flash. Now to look up what that means. Unfortunately, the dead test manual doesn't cover the SX-64, so that's of no use. Thankfully, Commodore legend Ray Carlson comes to the rescue once again with this handy table that tells us exactly where we need to look. Armed with just enough knowledge to be dangerous, it's time to tear into this rare machine. Let's cue the music and cross our fingers. I discovered later that it's not necessary to remove the lower screws in case in order to access the CPU board that contains the RAM chips. Lesson learned for next time. There's a missing screw here, so I'll try and find a suitable replacement when it's time to put it all back together. And there we go. Now we can get our first look at what we're dealing with here. As expected, it's packed pretty tightly. We're interested in the CPU board here that contains most of the chips you'd expect in a Commodore 64, including the 6510 and RAM. Attached directly to the CPU board is this I/O board that contains the two complex interface adapter chips and acts as a bridge between the other boards in the system. Right behind the I/O board is the 1541 disk controller, and behind that is a narrow PCB that houses all the physical connectors on the back panel. The 1541 occupies a big chunk of space with the storage bin and cartridge port sitting above it. The tiny CRT and supporting components along with the speaker fill up this area, and a compact power supply rounds out the cast of characters. A common cause of SX-64 issues is also the easiest to fix. The pin header where the I/O board connects to the CPU board tends to separate over time, as is the case with this example. Gently pushing the two back together can sometimes fix the errors. Unfortunately, that was not the case here and the problems remained, so we've got to go deeper. The CPU board is held in by 3 plastic push pins and 3 Molex connectors. To extract it, it's also necessary to free the I/O board and separate the two. Detaching the backplane also gives you more clearance to work around the short power connector lead. And there we go, one CPU board ready for its operation. The 6510 lives here, and you can see the owner has already attached heatsinks to all of the chips. The VIC-2 comes as standard from the factory with its own heatsink, no doubt due to the tight packaging of the system and poor cooling. The 6581 SID lives here, and the character, kernel, and basic ROMs are all together in a column, with Jiffy DOS having been previously installed. What we're most interested in is the RAM, and specifically UA4 here. Sometimes it's possible to locate a bad RAM chip by touch because a short can cause them to heat up more than others. I wanted to confirm the dead test diagnosis, so I let the system warm up for 10 minutes, but I wasn't able to feel any difference, nor did my infrared thermometer register anything unusual. 3, 2, 1. Let's solder. Ahem. As usual, I like to add some fresh solder to this 35-year-old stuff as it helps with the extraction, and I don't want to take any chances messing up this rare system that doesn't even belong to me. Et voila! Through the magic of editing, the old chip is out. But seriously, it's probably time to invest in a proper vacuum desoldering tool. I ended up spending about 15 minutes off camera cleaning up the passages with desoldering braid, and I even had to snip some of the legs off the old RAM because the solder on the top side of the board wouldn't come out cleanly. I had some C64 RAM left over from repairing the donated bread bin, and it's the same stuff the SX uses, so let's socket this thing up and see what happens. Hey, I'm still an amateur at this, but I've seen worse. If I can do this, anyone can. In order to test the repair, I'm going to set the board back in place and reconnect it loosely, but I won't reinstall the back panel or the push pins until I know things are good. Okay, moment of truth. Let's hope the dead test didn't lie to us and that there aren't multiple failures. Well, would you look at that? I love it when a plan comes together. Let's fire up the dead test again and see if it's happy. It's not a full diagnostic, and for that you need a harness that I don't have, but it's a good starting point. Now, if there's one thing I'm really bad at, it's organized sports. If there are two things I'm really bad at, it's organized sports and arts and crafts. Wait, is that three things? Look, don't ask me to build a gingerbread house, okay? This I can probably handle. To reattach the cap on the carrying handle, I'll first need to remove the old adhesive. This tool is part of a kit for automotive audio install and shouldn't damage the plastic like a screwdriver would. I'll spare you from having to watch the whole thing and then repeating this 3 more times, so let's move along. This double-sided foam tape is just about the same thickness as the original adhesive, so it should work nicely. It needs to fit in the cap and also have a center cutout because the center screw is fixed in place while the bearing rotates around it. I found that most household adhesives do not stick to polyethylene sandwich bags, so they're perfect to protect the tape while we're working on it. Okay, not bad. I'll repeat this for the other side, and then we can move on to reattaching the handle. Oh yeah, that's much better, and the locking mechanism works perfectly now. Oh, and I was able to find the correct size screw to replace the missing one, but it's not the right color. It's better than nothing though. Okay, so first impressions of the SX-64? Well, it's big and heavy. Of that, there's no denying. It's also insanely cool and something any retro enthusiast would love to chat about. The screen can be hard to read, but it's actually fine for a lot of games. I just hate to use it for long hours with productivity software. Fortunately, it can be attached to external displays and drives. There are known issues with the cartridge compatibility, but the Ultimate 2 Plus I was using has timing adjustments that fix the problems I had initially. Like all systems of this age, the more you use them, the more they're likely to break. Unfortunately, that's the dilemma we all face with this hobby. Last thought. These machines are a bit harder to work on than regular C64s, but the chips that commonly fail are often the same parts, so spares are available. Just be careful not to damage any of the SX-specific boards. So there we have it, a fully working Commodore SX-64. It's definitely a neat collectible, and one that I've lusted after since I was a child. So thanks again to Justin for loaning us this machine to play around with and make this video. I hope you enjoyed this bit, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.